lot of years of I was a research professor for about 10 years at the University of New Mexico, and I'm really trained as a child psychologist. So I've done a multitude of things, including direct clinical practice, a tribal college president for a number of years, and then gone into doing different things, and really have expanded the work I learned as a clinician, as an Indigenous psychologist, to the current work you're going to see. Right now, I'm the Associate Director for Research and Evaluation at the Center for Native American Youth, and we're located at the Aspen Institute. And let me see. Okay, we do a wonderful program and several programs, but what we really believe is, and the basic premise of the Center for Native American Youth and the Aspen Institute, is to really help our Native youth find innovative ways to develop strength, to capitalize on their rich culture, and to address their needs of their communities and their tribes. And we turn that into connection to state senators and representatives. And the training is really focused on narrative change and how can our youth really tell their story, but really get access to some ears that will provide funding or intervention, or even just problem solving. So our youth are well connected. Some of our youth have been featured in Vogue for their work in mental health, as that they picked that as their work, and one of our major pieces of work, and I'll talk a little bit more in depth about that later, is our Remembering Our Sisters Fellowship. This fellowship really focuses on missing and murdered Indigenous women, Two-Spirit, and girls and others. And so we're really proud of that. And we've had some phenomenal outcomes of it. But CNAY is really focused on, it's really a youth empowerment model to assure that our youth have access to quality information that will help support their passion and their goals. And it's for age 18 to 24. However, there have been times where we've designed it for 14 and above. So we know for our youth that there are many, they really have a heart. They really have good intentions. They're often very well educated, very smart. Sometimes not. Sometimes they're working as coordinators in their tribal communities and haven't had advanced education. So we take them where they're at and we help support them, their knowledge base from where they're at. So we know that for our youth and for even mobilizing any tribal community, that colonization has changed the ability for us to continue to impact the way our daily lives are, to interact with others, cope in loss, and work towards future goals. So the process of colonization has had radical changes on how our youth feel that they can be empowered and they can be heard. So community mobilization requires a more deeper strategic approach to obtain cross-community ownership and representation. And that's where we go at CNAY. We really encourage our youth to develop programs or develop projects that are empowering in their communities and then that are built from their communities, and we teach them how to do that. We use a lot of community-based participatory research practices. I was trained in it at the University of New Mexico by Dr. Nina Wallerstein, and have really latched on to that as a researcher, as an Indigenous researcher. So we also know that within our tribal systems, that sovereignty is really important as our youth look at how do I infiltrate tribal communities, or even urban communities, and how the tribe provides that oversight. And then most importantly, what we do really well, and this has been my big piece, is the clarification of intergenerational trauma and laws. And so we really put that at forefront, and I teach our training and then follow up through with the youth on historical trauma and effects on interactions and the effects on our own personal trauma, our distal trauma, our proximate trauma, and our historical trauma. So we've got to understand that historical trauma implications for our youth creates chronic trauma in a lot of our communities. And our youth have been raised in those communities and are well aware that there is something there that really impacts movement in tribal communities. So we know, we looked at, I as a researcher looked at all the research. And so there was a meta-analysis done of research and about an Indigenous framework in tribal communities. And one of the things that was found in a lot of these, and this is going to be old school to many of our Native providers out there, is this isn't going to be new news, but that our elders are the keepers and transmitters of knowledge, that our elders, including myself, I guess I'm in that category now, I begrudgingly say that, have endured many adversities, and our life stories hold lessons and foundational knowledge to better understand resilience. I can't underscore that enough, because we really encourage a connection to elders to really find out what are the traumas that our people have experienced. They're the keeper of that, but what are the stories that we've endured that have surpassed that? Those stories are there. It's not all about trauma, but it's really about, hey, 500 years, we're still here, right? And so our youth get those critical messages as we foster and help them find a way to reach out to elders in their communities, or if they're urban youth, in other elders throughout the United States. So our youth and society really know that there's a disconnect between our youth and our elders, and that our urban youth, American Indian youth, really face a hard time getting connected with elders. So at CNAY, we really foster that. We have a number of elders that we reach out to help champion our youth and to help provide a relationship-based experience for them. That's critically important when we look at engaging with Native youth. If I hand them a book of career, this isn't about this. This is a relationship-based experience for our youth. And we engage in a relationship with our youth to make sure that they have an understanding and access to resource, and we become that resource. And if we're not the resource, we find the resource for them. So we understand that disconnect between our elders and youth, and that our urban American Indian youth face greater challenges. And as research has indicated, that ties to culture and other variables, social support, family systems, are protective factors and lead to resilience in our youth development. So when we look at the research, the protective intergenerational strategies are just this, and this isn't news to Native folks: spirituality, tribal identity, elders, ceremonies and ritual, humor, oral tradition, family, and support networks. I just said that. Those are all the things that encompass and that have been indicated in quality research done by, as you can see, Heavy Runner and Morris, done by Native researchers in the area, and has identified these as protective strategies. And we recognize that, and we incorporate that into our training, into our curriculum. So the literature review indicates that protective factors around resilience is really what I said: understanding the elders' stories, understanding how did the Blackfeet survive starvation winter? How did, understanding all those things. How did the Blackfeet survive the Baker Massacre and the resilience of that? And I'm going to talk later on about Eloise Cabell, who's one of my heroes. And I'm going to talk about her narrative. Our intergenerational relationships are critically important to the development of our youth, family, community, and that connectedness and culture, storytelling, sense of belonging, sense making. So we encourage our youth to develop narratives or stories that helps promote their ideals or their programs or their projects or their passion and spirituality, whether it be higher power, whether it be ceremony, whether it be God. We really incorporate spirituality. We did a long piece of research with a number of American Indian leaders. We did a qualitative evaluation, a qualitative research and a survey, and found that spirituality is often left out of a lot of the curriculum or the processes that are really youth need to, and it was first and foremost with a lot of our Indigenous leaders. This is really an Indigenous leadership program. So the literature research identified that there are key resiliency factors for American urban youth. And they get a lot of strength in what I said, knowing the history and roots. And adults and elders' view on culture were different from our youth. And that was important to understand. So culture is collective. We draw from generational strengths as elders. We practice, we get strength. We always say those who came before us. We always honor our ancestors. And that connection to them makes us feel grounded and feeling grounded. However, youth really see culture as specific skills. And that's kind of where they are, like culture. They believe it's slipping away, but they know it has strength, but they don't know it. And so we really are trying to circumvent the things that our youth see that they don't have access to or they don't really understand. And the bottom line is the oppressive policies of the government have disrupted the relationship between our youth and elders due to boarding school, due to relocation, due to the genocidal policies of the United States. And I talk about that in our historical trauma sessions. So we've begun to believe in the dominant narrative. And the dominant narrative is set and controlled by non-native. So our history, I never knew about the difficulty or the oppression that came with Manifest Destiny as a 8th grader in school. I thought, oh, great, everybody's coming. We're going to share everything. And so it was presented that way from a white colonizer point of view, that Manifest Destiny was really a saving grace to Native folks. It wasn't, and we know that. So we look at existing negative narratives and try to circumvent them with Indigenous knowledge, transfer of knowledge and thought. When we look at the dominated narrative or the colonizing narrative, it's often deficit framing. So often when we look at the research or the implications for our youth, it's like, oh, they don't measure up to the other youth. And one of my major pieces of research in my work has looked at the bias that we know exists in testing, academic or intelligence testing, and really look at those biases because we know they exist and they intentionally misdiagnose or mislabel our children as underlearners, and we're not. And that's that deficit framing, that we don't meet a standard, but that standard doesn't take into account the way we learn, the relationship-based learning, the esoteric and essential learning that comes from thinking, seeing, and feeling and experiencing. We know that's how Indian children learn. They have a different style of learning. Native American communities are framed as deficits or burdens to society. Oh, the res is just a cesspool. It's a third world country, but they bypass the fact that people believe in the culture and they stay here for reasons because of the culture being a somewhat a big protective factor. And we know research shows throughout all the research that when we look at deficit framing and not strength-based or not cultural supportive framing, it is psychologically harmful to our youth. So we're looking for our youth to be empowered through narrative change. Our narratives create the perception that we have and the interpretations of facts. And it's often controlled by media, pop culture, education curricula. And individuals draw on these limited narratives to make sense of other groups and themselves. So the big thing has been about mascots and the tomahawk chop. And we know there is research out there that this really impacts our Native youth self-esteem and self-perception. So why do we allow these to happen? Well, that's the dominant culture's narrative of who we are as people, and the dehumanizing of who we are as Native people through things like mascots and tomahawk chops. So the dominant narrative is controlled, like I said, by the colonizers. It's really deficit framing. And, like I said, it's very harmful. So like Native Americans have the highest poverty rate. Native American communities suffer from obesity, suicide, and diabetes. Okay, those may be true, but has anybody looked at the psychological and the historical effects that the government set us up to have nothing? They took our children away to annihilate our belief in our prayer life, in our spirituality, in our language, in our educational system that had already occurred. So all these things are from that dominant culture narrative. So they don't look at the preceding difficulties that the colonization has impacted our Native folks and our Native youth. Yes, we live in poverty, but we were purposely put on impoverished areas with the hope that we would die. That was it. That was a genocidal policy. And of course, as we look at the things about diabetes and suicide, we know that the dependence on commodities that was genetically foreign to our bodies and created difficulties for us to process the sugar and the flour. I just read a huge piece of work done by when natives were given flour, they didn't even know what to do with it. So they took and start eating it because they were so hungry, because our buffalo had been removed. All our natural ways of living had been removed, and it started to cake in their stomachs and they got sick. Remember, when we were given commodities and rations, when the colonization began to happen, we weren't given good food. We were given rancid meat. We were given lard and flour full of bugs. But when you're hungry, you eat what you do and you make do with what you do, right? And so when we look at suicide, the same is true for suicide. We don't look at the historical factors that contribute to the sense of loss and self-esteem and low self-worth, that if the government really believed we were so bad, or the colonizers really, their goal was to make us feel less than and dehumanize us, remember, we're the savage, then we're going to interpret those and internalize that oppression. And it continues to affect us today as we move forward and as we try to build healthy communities and healthy youth. So we really believe in asset framing at CNAY. A community starts out with value, but has fallen short of its potential due to a myriad of things. And historical trauma is a huge contributor to our inability to move forward. Our deficit, if we look at deficit framing, it focuses on our shortcomings and requires us to prove a community is human and has an added value to society. So as you can see, with the deficit framing, we're called upon to meet a model that was really built to keep us out of the mainframe or to keep us from moving forward. And that's a deficit model. So narrative change work seeks to reframe and change the dominant culture and create more political possibilities for social movements. Our youth who go through our program become social movers and really at the top echelon of social movement. They're featured at the White House. They've been invited to the White House Native Youth Sentiment. So all those things are very helpful as we grow and help our youth to increase their self-esteem and their access to culturally supported frameworks. We use a strong asset-based narratives to challenge dominant ideas, and that's what we teach our youth. Your narrative, your experience of what your grandma taught you, or living in poverty, or even overcoming substance abuse, those are critical elements that can move you forward and can move your narrative forward. Deficit, it's you've overcome them. That's a strong asset. That's how our people honor each other. They've overcome so many obstacles and so many policies of governmental genocide. And we shift the hearts and minds on issues that shape the current reality for Native Americans. So you can see it's an in-depth relationship-based approach for our youth, and we teach them how to do that, or we help build on their current knowledge of that and strengthen that. So we use, and this is really critically important at CNAY, we use an Indigenous framework. And indigenizing a framework allows for our relationships, our youth relationships, to not be defined how curriculum says they should be defined, but to be defined by the experience within the relationship. If we're not taking time to develop relationships in tribal communities or with our tribal youth, I was a adolescent drug and alcohol counselor for a number of years, and so know how critically important this is. We implement Indigenous ways of knowing and transfer of knowledge. We use those terms all the time because when we say transfer of knowledge, it's not, I'm going to teach you. It's, I'm going to transfer knowledge to you, and you're probably going to transfer knowledge to me. So it's a symbiotic, very yin and yang relationship with our youth, because we learn quite a bit from them, and what we learn we try to incorporate and continue to improve our curriculum. It is asserting the significance of application of Indigenous knowledge within all things. So we remind them that in everything, in medicine, in food, in plants, in relationships and spirituality. And we look in our civics, we do a civics training. We look at the Iroquois Nation and their constitution. The United States didn't develop their constitution. It was developed off of what they seen the Iroquois Nation do. So we really honor those in our history and really tell the stories of those in our history. Even around medicine, we talk about how the I think it's a birthing technique, Lamar, something like that. That really is a native birthing technique that a guy from France looked at, and he made a birthing technique that he capitalized on. So we use methodologies that draw from Indigenous knowledge, language, metaphors, philosophies, and experience former colonized, historic, marginalized communities to critique mainstream methodologies. This ain't our method. This isn't our methods. What would our method look like? We have actual methods. So we decolonize and indigenize mainstream methodologies. And we envision other ways of doing research and claiming space for our youth for a fifth paradigm. We create an Indigenous space for our youth to channel, to foster, to understand, to talk about, to embellish our Indigenous ways of knowing. So for CNA, one of our flagship programs is Remembering Our Sisters. Remembering Our Sisters is really looking at how do our young women or men or two spirits address such a traumatic event or such a traumatic, it's not a philosophy, it's a born act against our people when we look at murdered and missing Indigenous women. And so we had a 6 months fellowship. It was all women this time, but they developed some huge projects with elders, with their community. They made digital storyboards. They did active moving storyboards on the web, and their work and their research was phenomenal. But what we did in that, and it's really important, is that we also, as we went along this, we understood the trauma response to this work. And so we continued to include ceremony, psychological resources. I worked a lot with the youth to make sure that they weren't having, countertransference with even the material that they're dealing with, because it is very traumatizing. And so we put in our CNA Indigenous leadership experience, this is what we ask ourselves all the time. How do contemporary Indian leaders function in relationship to historical legacy and new institutional structures? What are the achievement needs and opportunities for leadership in Indian country in the future? Are there commonalities among different tribal leadership experiences? Can one usefully identify specifically Indian styles of leadership in the historical and sociological record? If so, how have their elements changed in relation to conquest and colonization? And how might Indian leadership's practices transform the wider world leadership? What is Indigenous leadership? And so we've actually done surveys and qualitative interviews and focus groups all along this. So we have some very definitive pieces of work that really show that Indigenous leadership is quite different than mainstream or colonized leadership. And so we present that to our youth so that they have an understanding, and it actually resonates with how they see how it's different. So we promote a culturally safe youth. We indigenize their spaces, we hear their voices, we recognize and teach how colonization has its impact on our speaking up and our taking on things and our fear of being ridiculed. We're sensitive to the dynamics of power and teach about privilege and oppression, because oftentimes in DC, where those senators may not always respond faithfully or well to your project. And we got to recognize that that's the dynamics of power, privilege, and oppression. We build relationships and we teach them using their narrative how to advocate for change. So this is one of those crazy things I forget what they're called, but this is what came out. And that the larger words come out in all the things and creates this diagram. And I just love it. It's just pretty darn awesome with culture being there. People want to be safe to talk about their culture. They want to be respected. They want knowledge. They want it to be positive. And I think this is experience in unity. So you can see what our youth are crying out for. So CNA's curriculum, we are based definitively on the transfer of knowledge. And it is persuasion and influence changes within the context. And so for our ROS fellows, or Remembering Our Sisters fellows, we supported the native transfer of knowledge and its efficacy. And when we transfer knowledge, it's a very ceremonious transfer of knowledge, because throughout we would have little trauma-focused ceremonies. Like at the end, we had a small little calling your spirit back, and a small giveaway where it wasn't about a artwork our goods. It was about, what did you learn here that you want to give to your sisters here? What are you taking away? And so that giveaway in that context was an Indigenous giveaway of thought, experience, hopes, and dreams. And it was really helpful to put it in a ceremony format. The Indigenous leadership model supports the natural native ways of our circular leadership and collective identity. And we provide that opportunity to promote empowerment and service to Indian country. Their narratives is built on the reciprocity in change and is prevalent in their qualitative data. And let me give you some of the things. The qualitative data, which we do multi-methods. Of course, we do surveys because, our funders want to look at those surveys. They want that hard bean counter data, and it's very valuable, but we rely heavy on community-based participatory research. And through that, our youth learn how to be social advocates, also while being active in what we're doing. And it's a strengthening of our narrative and their personal story for critical change and advocacy. And that's definitive throughout our qualitative data collection. The other thing is self-care and mental health care while doing trauma work. When we look at any of the work that our youth are doing, whether it be mental health, addictions, education, throughout it, because of the colonization and the history of colonization, trauma is woven throughout. So we concentrate heavily on self-care and mental health care while they're working through these bigger, larger issues. And that support, that added support, helps our youth address distal trauma, understand moving towards advocacy, so that they don't get stuck or they don't have a trauma response that keeps them from moving forward. Oftentimes when our people are working in areas that are very hugely trauma-related, which are multiple, they get stuck. They do the approach avoidance thing that's very reticent of PTSD. So we help them understand that and help them engage in more positive movements forward that doesn't impact this trauma response, or how to recognize the trauma response and how to move forward through the trauma response. So this is some of our qualitative data. Of course, there's overlying themes, but I think presenting it like this is just critically important. So this is from our Remembering Our Sisters Youth, and it's kind of gaining insight into the importance of the issue. It was impactful to start with historical trauma and getting a background of land and body violence from colonization. How did that play into missing and murdered Indigenous women? So we talk about that. Fellows from all over, the importance of the steps we can take to address the issues within states. The fellowship Fellowship created a sisterhood to address the issue and focusing nationally, and getting Native women from different areas is influential. We had the representative from South Dakota talk to the youth, who's big, who is the big, her big format was missing and murdered Indigenous women and youth. They can hear you. So CNAY provided all these national opportunities to greater national impact people out there to help move their advocacy and their narrative forward. Being able to go against Western society as inferior and not taking steps to achieve. Breaking those barriers and stereotypes, all the things I talked about earlier in this presentation, and carrying the resilience, everyone who has taken on the tropes of different fields. We can work toward healthy, thrive, safe communities, looking for other young Native American people. I think mainly doing everything out of love and upholding the values instilled in me. making sure I'm doing it for the community's best interest and care. My grandma reminded me, I am representing everyone. The experience reminded me what Grandma said. So you can see how we integrate historical knowledge and transfer of knowledge that is laden in our grandmothers, our ancestors, and how critically is important to be to honor that knowledge and use that knowledge as a basis for our youth to move forward. Kind of gaining insight into the importance of the issue was impactful to start with historical trauma and getting a background. Oh, I did that one. Okay, wait now. Let me move on. So for me, when, oh yeah, okay. So for me, and we're coming to close, and I want to make sure we have enough time. One of my heroes has been Eloise Cabell, and I'm sorry, I always got to cry when I talk about her, because she had a narrative of our homelands here. Not far from where I am today, I'm on my son's ranch and on the Blackfeet Reservation, and you can hear him talking in the background. But she tells the story of Ghost Ridge, and where she lived, she would go to this place, and her uncle would tell her, that's where our people were killed, and that the government, although they were a treaty tribe, they were murdered on Ghost Ridge. And she would talk about that. And so her whole ideal against fighting against the BIA and the irreparable harm that they did to tribal people and removing lands or not compensating for our lands resulted in our land back or our buyback issues. And she fought for that until she died. And she told the story throughout where she went of that. And she told the story of how Mabel Little Bull would sit by a fire and in a small little house, and she never wanted to challenge her lease check, even though she knew it was small, because she was afraid that the government would get mad and not give her what little lease check she had already. And she was living in poverty, where she was land rich. And so those kinds of stories of our ancestors who suffered and were afraid allows our youth to understand that we have to be advocates and that those stories are critically important. And I honor Eloise, Yellow Bird Woman. I honor her in these things because she's a quintessential example of how you use your narrative for advocacy and change. Sorry. So our recommendations are strategies to enhance resiliency among youth, intergenerational communication, how our culture is our resilience, our culture is our mitigator, our culture is our barrier for sustaining force, and how we can call upon our culture to overcome challenges. And to use those methods that the storytelling of Eloise, of Mabel Little Bull, of those things that have been very detrimental to our society, but are the stories that we build upon to go to an asset place of movement for our youth. And that we need to increase these opportunities for our youth. We need to understand our tribal opportunities, especially to have a program like this in your schools. This here is something that I have, it's followed me through my graduate work. It's followed me through a lot of my work. And it's just this: we can't continue to say that, oh, it's from our framework, it's from our knowledge, because our knowledge is drenched and based in colonized principles and philosophies. It's returning what we need to know to the community, to tribal communities, to tribal people. And to cure the wounded, one need to only return them to their community or construct a new one. We tell our youth, you have the propensity, you have the genetic ability, you have the ancestral strength and story to make changes. And many of our people, like Eloise, have made those changes in advocacy. So with that, I'm done. Do you have any questions or comments?
Beautiful presentation, Dr. Billie Jo Kipp. I always appreciate learning and just hearing more from you. So again, if folks are more comfortable sharing questions or comments anonymously, feel free to send me your question directly, or if you're comfortable, you can take yourself off mute and share anything maybe that stood out to you during this presentation. And
thank you, Tasha Peltier, soon to be Dr. Peltier. It was Ruth Buffalo from North Dakota. Thank you so much. She was one of our main presentations. And thank you to Lamaze, Lauren. Thank you. That escaped me, but it was just Lamaze is it. It was built in tribal communities, and it taught our women how to birth their children. So thank you for that. Thank you. And thank you, Tasha. I'm very honored that you attended today. And I think I'm done. Am I, Alicia?
Yeah, the session ends at 2:15. So if no one has questions, so something for me, and just being an older sister too in my family, and a lot of the youth in my family community continuing to reside on our Navajo Nation reservation in New Mexico, and all over the place. And I know Center for Native American Youth do a lot of great work in creating opportunities and resources. So I just wanted to see if you know or have any more recommendations of how people can have access and where they can find these opportunities. Wondering if you have anything else to share about that.
Well, I think, when we look at the opportunities, I'm actually recognizing that Native Forward, which used to be American Union Graduate Center, they now offer Native leadership or Indigenous leadership. So I think it's really coming to fruition that a lot of our programs are now offering Indigenous leadership. I also am part of Native Youth Philanthropy Indigenous Leadership. And so I've been contracted to do some work with them, and they have helped. I've helped them design their curriculum around Indigenous knowledge and transfer of knowledge. So there are a number of organizations now incorporating our focusing. We focus on Indigenous leadership at CNAY. And I'm very lucky that we're able to get funding for it. So a lot of people are doing that. So if you just type in Indigenous Leadership Program, it'll send a list. It's not an overabundance, Alicia, but good things start in little pieces, and we'll just make it grow like wildfire.
Yes, I agree. Tasha, I see you raise your hand. I'll go ahead and let you unmute.
Yeah, can you guys hear me okay? Awesome. Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm traveling, so I might cut out. But I just really wanted to thank Dr. Kipp for her presentation. I think she just really validated a lot of the things that we have a nonprofit organization focused on uplifting our culture and improving health and wellness within Standing Rock through that. And really, we see that, it's hard to fit our ways of knowing and being into the mainstream society view of wellness, and we see how our youth are impacted by their experiences in the educational institutions. That dominant narrative that you talk about really does shape them and their own views of themselves. And so just really thankful for all of the information that you shared with us today, and like I said, it just really validates what we're seeing and what we know.
Thank you, Tasha. And I really appreciate that, because I think that if there was a takeaway, is that we can't continue to expect our youth to fit in modalities of mainstream education if we don't incorporate those things that they know. So as a child psychologist, it was always, okay, meet your child at where they're at. How do they see things? Well, nobody's asking our children, how do you see things? And through this kind of process, we ask our children, how do you see things? And what in our culture and our history can help you see them differently or better or more supportive? And so it's really that asset-based framing of our culture and the value of our culture that has been eradicated by mainstream education. They didn't want us, we're struggling with boarding dorms, and I see you have a presentation up, but we have that continued trauma around that. Well, education hasn't been kind to us at all, nor has it honored us as learners. Because they don't understand how Native youth learn. Native youth have to have that visceral learning opportunities. It's not from that book. It's not from that test. It's from experiencing education. And that's how we live and how we've taught.
Thank you, Dr. Kipp. We have another question in the chat box by Lauren. So it's, many of students are being raised by the grandparents, although this helps bridge the generation gap. And, I see pain in the children that their parents aren't able to be there for them. How can we reframe this?
Yeah, that's a great question. I was the tribal college president here at Blackfeet for 6 years. I'm the longest sitting there, and then I went on to do other things. But we had a conference one day where we brought in all the little children, and I forget what it was, a comic something conference. And one of the things I asked in the whole gallery of the Indian youth who were like in grade school on up to middle school, I asked them, how many of you have parents at home? None. How many of you have lost one parent? Almost 80%. How many of you have lost two parents? Almost 80%. So thank you, Lauren. This has kind of become the norm in Indian country because of addiction, because of loss, because of trauma. And so I think how we reframe that is we allow that our children, that your grandparents, and I've raised two granddaughters who just lost their mom. And I always reminded them, I'm your grandmother, and I may have different views, but your mom still loves you. She just can't love you right now. She loves you, but she's, sick. She's got chronic illness of substance abuse. And once they understood that it was chronic illness that took their parents away, it was different than the ugly term of alcoholism or addiction. We say, like when people die from cancer. I just gave a presentation here on the Blackfeet Reservation. When people have cancer, we go, how can we help? What can we do? Well, cancer is chronic illness. Addiction and substance addiction is chronic illness, but we don't look at it like that. We think there's something wrong with that person. No, that person has a chronic illness, and we should afford them all the opportunity and empathy and compassion that we do somebody dying of cancer. So I encourage grandparents to remind them that their parents aren't there, maybe because they have a chronic illness or something like that. And I know it's really hard. So when I was a provider at the University of New Mexico in the children's outpatient program, I worked with a lot of Navajo families, and the struggle that a lot of the grandparents had with the couple of the Navajo youth, infatuation, if you will, with ICP. If anybody doesn't know that, that's insane clown posse, very prevalent in the Southwest for some reason. And what I would teach grandparents, because they thought it was devil stuff, right, is to allow them their exploration of this, but also keep them connected to their traditional teaching and their traditional ways. And so for the youth who were raised by grandparents, the therapeutic goal was to really bridge those misunderstandings, help that youth with the grief of or loss of parents, but also to bridge the understanding of grandparents and how to understand that. So I think that was a really important intervention, and anybody can do that if you're compassionate enough, if you have empathy, if you understand cultural values, that of course our youth are going to steer. That's just within their developmental mind, huh? Adolescents' minds are set to revolt. And so we've got to make sure that's a positive experience and foster that while keeping them connected to our culture. I hope that answered your question, Lauren. I don't know.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kipp. So we do have another question, another great question. So it is so important to help bridge our youth with cultural ways, preparing them to enter the dominant culture. What words as parents do we say to our youth as they leave for college?
I think we say, when I left for college, I was much later on in life. And one of the things my mom told me was, why do you want to do that? Why do you want to do that to yourself and your family? I had already raised 5 kids, but her experience with education was very oppressive. It's so oppressive that she didn't finish high school. And so I think we've got to remind our children that you're going to go and learn new, different ways, but always try and find where are the core values, where are the core concepts of our culture. Because the more we get away from our core values in our tribal communities, in our tribal belief system, the more we're likely to have psychological distress. Now that's research and it's knowledge. And so we really remind them as they head off to don't come back if that's not in the cards for you, because we always say, go get educated, come back. But quite frankly, a lot of our tribal communities don't have that loop for educated folks to come back. And so we've got to often remind our youth that education will change you, but keep your core values, because that will sustain you. And so we're talking about cultural sustainability, those things that will sustain you. Pray every morning, practice before your test, bring sweetgrass, hold it in your hand. You don't know how many sage stalks I had during comps, but I had a lot, and it helps. It helps. So we keep them connected, stay connected. Come home when you feel lost. We'll do things to keep you connected.
I love that. Thank you so much, Dr. Kipp. So we do have about 5 more minutes left. Did anyone have any comments or questions? Keep them coming. If not, we could wrap up.
And please, if anybody's looking for how we admit, we do a national application process for our youth. So please keep that in mind. Alicia, you can give them my contact information and they can contact me, and I can tell we do it on a yearly basis. So let me know. We do a lot of other things. So there's a lot of, we do youth and civics, we do civic engagement. We do civic engagement, we do land grant, advocacy and land acquisition. So we do a lot of specialized programming for youth around different issues.
Awesome.
Okay.
Yeah, so thank you again so much, Dr. Kipp, for sharing your stories, your knowledge and resources with us today. The National Indian Health Board is always grateful to have you on for our behavioral health event today. Just a reminder for everyone to fill out your sessions evaluations and to sign out to receive your CE credits, and that this session today was recorded and will be on the NIHB webpage, the National Indian Health Board. So again, thank you everyone for your time and support in today's event. So have a great day.
Okay, have a good day.